welcome back. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. This is going to be a really interesting well, I have to say that all of the podcasts are interesting conversations. This one is coming from someone else who's representing just north of the United States in Canada, Elizabeth. And I met Elizabeth, let me give you a little context here, back in 2020, when COVID hit, before the murder of George Floyd, when COVID hit and internal communicators were thrust into basically similar frontline experiences where they had to have the answers and have a plan and really be in the mix of making major decisions for employees on how businesses would run. I saw so many of my peers, of my clients, get so burned out. They were so tired. They were exhausted. They needed support because they had not only that going on from a professional standpoint, and internal communications is notoriously under-resourced and underfunded, and to be thrust in such a critical position without all of what they need, and nobody could foresee what a global pandemic would mean to many organizations today. Not many crisis communication playbooks would include a global pandemic at this level, at this impact. But they had the personal stuff going on where they were afraid for their own families, for their own safety, for their employees, their teams. How do you manage through that? So I was watching this happen, and some of my clients were going into surgery because they were the stress level was so insane. And so I put together an internal communications support group, basically. And I just wanted to pull people together as a place where we could learn what each other's doing, but at the same time, just be present with each other and help people know that they're not alone, and that they can be in a virtual room with people who get it, who understand, who are there and have been there. And so there was just this community that we needed to build. And so over 100 people started out, and then there was this core group that just kept showing up every Friday morning. And Elizabeth was a part of that core group, and we just kept it going. And I was kind of writing my portion of the conscious communicator while I was in this group. And that was spurred on by the murder of George Floyd and all the black boxes that communicators were posting on social media and making these commitments and putting them on blogs and websites and internal, communications and emails that were going out. And so we would meet on a weekly basis, and I was constantly bringing forth things that we needed to be doing to show up in this way, not only in COVID, but now with the racial reckoning that was begging for reconciliation. And so we were navigating that as a comms group throughout the time. It ended up going, I thought it would be a few months, right, Elizabeth? And it ended up going a year. And the group still meets without me. They have a group chats. I just learned about that. So we've kind of massaged it into the book club. There's so many people who read the book and come now at the end of every month and join the book club, and we talk about the book. But it's also this community, the continuation of the community. And there's a lot of the original group. That's the OG. When I say OG, the original group that met in 2020 is part of the book club as well. And so many more new faces that are here with us because of the group, because of the book, and because of the community. So that's the context of how I met Elizabeth. And she has done a testimonial in the book. I thank you for that. And so introduce yourself so people can kind of get an understanding of what your personal and professional experience and path has been.
Sure. Thanks, Kim. I always get goosebumps when we talk about that, because that was such an important piece of my journey, and you've been such an important piece of my journey. It's so bizarre that we've never met until this year. To know somebody that's been so impactful in your life. But so I'm Elizabeth Bunney. I'm third generation Métis citizen here in Edmonton, Alberta, which is Treaty 6 territory in Canada. My great-grandmother was Cree, and my great-grandfather on my mother's side was Polish, and so that's why I'm considered Métis on that side of things. My great-grandmother took scrip in order to marry my great-grandfather, which means she gave up her treaty rights and her treaty status and the promise of a better life. And so I'm pretty white presenting, and so it's, the rest of my mom's side of the family is quite dark, more Indigenous looking than I am. And so it's interesting sometimes when you tell people that you're Métis, people kind of question, they look at you like, oh, skin color. And I say often, I haven't thought so much about skin color as I have my own skin color as I have the past year, really connecting with my identity and figuring out where my place is in my Indigenous history. So yeah, I live in Edmonton. I have 2 adult sons. They're 26 and almost 20. One of them is a graphic designer, and it's just so amazing to be connected to him in a career that's so complementary to what I do as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know. That's about me. I've been in the profession for about 18 years. I have experience in external comms, internal comms, marketing comms as well. I'm the past president of the IBC Edmonton chapter, which is the second largest chapter of business communicators in the world. Nice to say past president and be able to take a little bit of a break from that. But really that's our chapter was almost 400 members strong in Edmonton, and we have a really thriving community here of communicators. So, yeah, that's me.
And one of the things that I really appreciate is that when we did connect in 2020, you immediately wanted to bring this conversation to your IABC Edmonton chapter. And so I came in, but you didn't stop there. You actually partnered with other Canadian IABC chapters, right? I don't remember how many, but there was quite the communion, if you will, of people coming together across Canada, thirsty for this kind of conversation and wanting to know, like, what do we do? What do we do with this? How do we handle this? And some great conversation came out of that, and some great relationships. So thank you for thinking of bringing this to your folks that you were, in touch with, but also expanding it across Canada.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I was just seeing, people, work isn't easy. No one has all of the answers, and it's changing daily. And so who can you lean on for support? And I've always leaned on other communicators. And so bringing everybody together, I think there was 6 different chapters in total that we brought together for that. And it was the largest attended PD session that we'd had for IABC. So thank you for doing that. And people were just hungry.
Absolutely. All right. So there's a really interesting intersection between what you just shared in your introduction. It's your personal experience, the ancestry that you represent, kind of like what's going on the inside and how you see the world. It's part of the lens that you see the world in, and then how the world sees you, people questioning your ancestry, which is like unbelievably crossing the line. But anyway, and then what you've done as a professional communicator, you actually merged those and started working at a firm. Well, I'll let you tell the story. Talk about the firm, and then the kind of work that you did. What kind of clients did you have? What kind of work were you asked to do?
Yeah, sure. So I left the corporate Canada world with the intent of freelancing last year, and started working with an Indigenous PR firm based out of Edmonton here. And I mean, the kind of work that they were doing was just really speaking to my connection to my roots, the combination of what I was doing as a communicator, and just really, wanting to do more, knowing that I had a skill set that could really help, a section of the population that could really use an amplification of their voice. And so started working at the PR firm, and one of the biggest clients, well, I'll start with one of the first clients actually that we worked with. It was an organization here in Canada that has had success overseas with water. They train water operators. It's an organization called Water First. Is that okay if I use names? Is that
yeah? If you think it's okay, I'm good with it.
Okay, so it's an organization
especially if it's a nonprofit or somebody, an organization that we can all support. I think that's really good to give visibility. Yeah.
Okay, absolutely. So it was a wonderful organization called Water First, and what they do is they train water operators from Indigenous communities, to operate water treatment facilities within their communities. So they train them, they have an internship program, and then they, send them back to their communities with these skill sets. And they, during you may have heard some of the Freedom Convoy stuff that happened last year in Canada. We don't need to rehash that, but they were recipients of a Freedom Convoy GoFundMe fund that, what was happening is the Freedom Convoy was trying to attach themselves to a lot of Indigenous issues to get exposure and empathy for some of those things. So they had a GoFundMe campaign, and they received, I think, something like $700,000, a beautiful contribution. But then they started to see that they were being attacked by other organizations and Indigenous communities about the fact that they were collecting all this money, but they were not doing anything to further water infrastructure issues, that they were actually just, training water operators and doing water education. And so, that's literally not what they do, but they were struggling as a nonprofit in a small little, I think they had maybe 2 or 3 people on their communications team, struggling, to try and defend themselves and, being attacked. And they didn't have the experience with that. So a couple months later, so they were still, kind of dealing with the aftermath of that. And a couple months later, they were the recipient of a major personal donation from Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively from their personal fund. And they were scared to do this announcement because of the kind of backlash that they'd received during the Freedom Convoy. And so they came to us and just were, a couple of weeks before the announcement, and they said, hey, we're scared. We're worried that this kind of exposure, this is on a very different level, that this kind of exposure is going to open us up to even more attacks on what we do. Could you just have a quick look at our press release? Could you give us some advice? Could you, just look at our plan of what we're doing and just, maybe give us a couple of suggestions of what we could do differently? And one of the first things that I picked up on as soon as I was starting to look through their materials is that their name is actually Water First Education and Training. And I was like, you very seldomly use your first full name or that company full name. You use Water First regularly because that's who you talk about yourself. And I said, use that in everything. Use your full company name and everything that you're talking about, because you have less of a chance of people attacking you when they see that you're literally just Water First Education and Training. You don't do infrastructure. So that was the first point. We provided some suggestions to them in terms of how they could, structure their press release. And then we also had some input into Ryan Reynolds' quote, actually. And he really wanted to push the infrastructure issue a little bit. He was really interested in pushing the water infrastructure piece, but Water First, such a tiny little nonprofit organization, they weren't, how could they take that on? So what we suggested is, his quote was actually, clean drinking water is a basic human right. And that's what we used as the headline. That was the headline that was used when the press release was out. That was the headline that was grabbed by most of the media outlets. And we had all kinds of different media outlets looking at that, like e-news or, some of those entertainment news, things that I've never had exposure to in my career. And so because of that, they had super positive, I'll just say, because of the advice that we gave them and those couple of things that we gave them, they had zero issues. They had zero backlash. They had nothing but positive feedback. And whether or not what we did really like if it might have been okay without us. But as communicators, we know those subtle changes make a huge difference and can really steer people in the right direction.
Clarity.
Yeah, clarity.
Clarity can really breed confidence. Without clarity, you may have seen this in a newsletter that I put out, breeds chaos. And sometimes that's intentional, but you were working on that clarity to breed that confidence. And that really, that clarity really helps the narrative of just getting people all on the same page.
Yeah.
And it sounds like Ryan Reynolds also needed to, get a little bit more clarity about what the work was as well. I think that's a really strong quote. And it's timely that you tell this story because the U.S. Supreme Court recently made a decision against the Navajo Nation in the United States region that's restricting water rights and not being able to make that accessible to the Navajo Nation. And here they are already having to deal with walking. We hear these stories of Africa walking miles to go get fresh water, and that's happening actually here as well. And so the Navajo Nation is now in a very difficult place once again, where water is delivered in barrels, etc. So there's more to it than that. We can put that in the show notes for people to learn more about what's going on there. But water rights and Indigenous rights and human rights, tying that all together.
Yeah.
So you were at this firm when the Pope visited Canada. And so I would love, you've got to have some stories. Like, there's got to be some stories out there. So like, how were you brought in, with what kind of remit? And what were some of the challenges that your clients, who were your clients? Like, what were your objectives in representing your clients and involved with the Pope's visit? And you got to tell us, a story or two.
Sure. Yeah. So the firm that I worked with actually was the Confederacy of Treaty 6 was their client, and Treaty 6 encompasses about 17 nations across Alberta and Saskatchewan here in Canada. And so up until that point, early, like I want to say May, June of last year, before the Pope's visit, it was kind of like, we had one or two people kind of on the calls, just making sure that we were there to represent Treaty 6, but we were also just kind of trying to get the lay of the land. What does this visit actually look like? There was very little information coming out of the church, coming out of the federal government about what actually this visit was about. It was pretty muddied. And so trying to get clarity on what that looked like. And so the team was working on that. I was not on the project at the time, just because we weren't sure what the resources were going to be. And then it became very, very clear that this was, we refer to this all the time as what they were trying to do is take the Pope in a box, travel that they normally do for their trips, and bring it to Amiskwaciwâskahikan and to Lac St. Anne in Alberta here for the apology that we were expecting, in the same way that they've done every single other trip. And this was not the same kind of trip. This was a very, very different kind of trip. I mean, I am of Roman Catholic background. I went to a Catholic school my entire life. I have a very complicated relationship with that religion. But we knew that there would be lots of polarizing, viewpoints about the Pope coming to visit and what that meant for Indigenous people. So it became pretty evident that our team was going to have to play a bigger role in pushing for Indigenous people and making sure that our voices were heard, and that the Confederacy had opportunities to speak to the media about what this trip meant, that it wasn't just, dictated by the church and told to them what they were going to say and where they were going to be. So we organized a press conference an international press conference at the beginning of the visit, just so that the chiefs had the opportunity to speak about what this visit meant to them. That was wild, actually. I mean, we did, our team put out a trauma-informed journalism guide when it became clear that, we were going to be speaking to media and working with media from all over the world. And these were people that really didn't understand the plight of Indigenous peoples and the histories of what had happened here in Canada and the genocide, residential schools history. And so, putting that at the forefront, for Indigenous people of this visit, and then having media come here and wanting to talk to them and pull those stories out, like we wanted to be able to give the media a little bit of background and context about who they were interviewing and what that looked like when, trauma-informed journalism. And so we shared that with the church. And from what I understand, that the church shared that with all of their media representation. It went far and wide. And I want to say that the experience that I witnessed versus what I've seen, in my career in comms, that during that time, media were super respectful. There were media journalists that offered protocol before they interviewed some of the survivors and some of the chiefs. Their questioning was respectful. They were patient when, I think at the end, it was after Amiskwaciwâskahikan when we had the apology, there was a bus assigned to all the journalists, and, the federal government was trying to push them through and told them that if they didn't get on the bus, if they didn't get on the bus, they weren't going to get out of Amiskwaciwâskahikan, which is where the apology was being held. And we told them that we would make sure that they got back so that they could actually hear from the chiefs. So we did a press conference at Amiskwaciwâskahikan as well after the apology. And so we held all those journalists back, and they stayed with us. And it was actually just a really moving experience for me as an Indigenous person, but also as a communicator, and just seeing how people were responding to the chiefs and the survivors who were speaking. And it was just really moving, actually, to see that there was a shift in how the media were approaching and dealing with the stories. So there was a level of respect, for sure.
Couple things that I want you to dig into a little bit here before I go on to my next question is kind of give us a high level of what the apology was about.
Sure.
And then something you and I talked about when we met in Toronto was that you were talking about protocol, that there are customs and traditions that Indigenous folks do that, say, Western journalists aren't aware of and don't understand, and the timing of things. Can you speak to that and how communicators and journalists can be respectful of the custom and traditions when they are working with Indigenous folks?
Sure. Yeah. So the apology actually came as a result of, in 2015, the federal government had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, who had 96 calls to action. 96 or 94. Sorry, I should have known that. But calls to action about what Canadians and what corporate Canada could do to move towards reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in Canada. And one of the actions was an apology from the Roman Catholic Church. And so in the spring of this year, there was a delegation, and I think it was mostly Métis people, but there was a delegation of Métis people that went to the Vatican and met with the Pope. And he was really, I wanted to say he was really affected. It's from what we could see, that he was really affected by some of the survivors that he talked to. And they asked him, and I guess he's been asked numerous times to come to Canada for the apology, but this time, for some reason, something was different. And he agreed to come. And I think that was in March of 2022. And he was here in July. So that was a pretty quick turnaround for a trip. So there was a lot of, I think they usually plan for those kinds of trips years in advance. Like this was put together in a couple of months. So it was a really important healing piece of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's recommendations. So in exchange for knowledge from a knowledge keeper or an elder or survivor, it's customary to exchange tobacco and to express gratitude for the knowledge that they're sharing with you. And so that's what we saw. We saw there was, some journalists were bringing tobacco and exchanging tobacco ahead of time with the person that they were interviewing, or to say thank you and in gratitude for the knowledge that was being exchanged and shared.
And there's also a timing issue, not issue, but there's a timing to the customs of there's a saging, there's a process in order to clear the space. And when the elders or survivors the tribal leaders are ready, that's when you start. It's not on, we're starting at 10 and everyone's going to start at 10. It's like, that's something that is part of that respect as far as the exchange and interacting and interfacing with Indigenous folks.
Yeah, that's right. And that's one of the things that you and I have talked about is since then I've participated in a couple of press conferences since then and can see that local journalists for sure. I mean, if the schedule says, if the media advisory says that the pipe ceremony is at 9:00 and they don't get finished on time or they don't get finished on the exact schedule, the journalists know that they're waiting. They're there for the duration. They block their calendars. They don't rush it. They don't try to push it. They know that out of respect for, the subjects that they're interviewing, or that for the chiefs and council or the survivors, that they wait and they show that respect. I would say that that's very different from in the past. They're pushing for the story and telling you, I've got a deadline at this time and we got to go. And if we miss it, so that's a definite shift.
That's progress.
That's progress. Yeah.
Showing that kind of, and people will talk to me of like, okay, we work on inclusion and belonging. And I'm like, okay, well, let's kind of pause on this belonging thing. Because usually belonging is like, I feel like I belong, so you should feel like you belong. And in this example you just shared, that's what belonging, has to involve is a co-creation of the space. And so you're seeing that in that example there. So yeah, that's a good thing. And I know that part of the Pope visits, there was a lot of protest by Indigenous folks talking about rescinding the doctrine of discovery. We don't have to get into that, but there's been updates since then where I believe he has rescinded the doctrine of discovery. And if you don't know about it, you need to know about it. It's basically why things happen. It was written in the 1500s or something. It was just like, yeah, we basically have the right to take everything, and we have the right to do all of these things, and take your land, colonize, and all the things. And so to rescind the doctrine of discovery is like, I cried, so yeah, because that's something Elizabeth and I have in common, is that I have Muskogee Nation ancestry, and that's, part of the lens. And I too was not raised in the customs and traditions and the language, because my grandmother was also a residential school survivor, and that was literally beaten out of her. So she was stoic and quiet and did not share those things in her mind to protect us. But we wanted nothing more from her but to learn about her history and her family. And since I've been an adult, I've been collecting stories and learning it, seeing my great grandmother's name on the Dawes Act rolls, and I have my roll card. It's the only frickin', ethnicity, race that I have to prove that I'm a part of with a government ID. And these folks were the first ones here. So yeah, but I'm white presenting as well. I live a white life. I absolutely do. And so this ongoing battle that I have in my soul, if you will, is a motivating factor it's among several motivating factors of why I do this work. But it's a lot of internal introspection, where literally half of my family killed the other half of my family. And so this kind of reconciliation that I'm constantly moving towards, this healing, this forgiveness, this speaking for my grandmother when she couldn't, is part of my motivating factors. So I would love to hear from you, your advice to communicators to go, like, can you speak to a land acknowledgement? I get this question a lot. That's why I'm giving it to you. So what is a land acknowledgement? What are we solving for with a land acknowledgement? And here's the question I get most often. How do we go beyond the land acknowledgement?
The land acknowledgements, they also came out of the TRC recommendations, and it was, a call for corporate Canada to recognize, the land that they're living on, the people that inhabited that land first. And so I think it started out with good intentions, but what's happened is it's become, kind of there's not a lot of understanding. People are saying them at the beginning of events, or they're saying them, in meetings or in their organizations, but it doesn't have the meaning. They're not taking the time to learn the names. They're not taking time to learn about who they really, have impacted, who lived on that land before them. And so land acknowledgements are really, they're a way for Indigenous people to connect with each other, to connect with the language, the culture, the land, the people that were there. It's a way for them to also to recognize who was there first. And so I think land acknowledgements, first of all, should never be delivered by an Indigenous person. They should be delivered by settlers. And what I really have tried to encourage people to do is really take those land acknowledgements, those base here, who was here, recognizing, the people that were here first, and taking it one step further. What's your commitment? What's your actual commitment to learning, to doing better? What in your profession could you do to help further advance, Indigenous peoples? What else could you do? What's your commitment? And so, I say this to communicators all the time. I place myself at the beginning of our events, and I encourage people to think about how they ended up here and what their connection to Indigenous peoples are, what they want to do, what their commitment of action is.
I mean, and some of the things I'll just add to your list of ways that people can go beyond the land acknowledgement is hiring Indigenous people, like invest in them. And, I have yet to really see a successful employee resource group for Indigenous people. And that is because we haven't hired them. There's not enough of them. There's less than 1% in most organizations. And that is those who self-identify.
Right.
And so there's this cycle that is occurring here that we aren't hiring them, but they also need, investments in education, housing, etc. So there's a lot of systemic barriers to get them to the point of being a part of your talent pool in some industries. And so we have to be like kind of follow the money, if you will, and then support those who are there and give them a voice and visibility, and apply the 3 C's that I talk about all the time: celebrate, crisis, and consistency. Mm-hmm. Have employee resource groups, have visibility. There is an entire month in the United States. Does Canada celebrate Native American Heritage Month in November?
It's in the month of June, actually. It's National Indigenous Peoples Month.
Okay.
Month. And
and we have Indigenous Peoples Day.
History Month.
That's replacing Columbus Day in October. So that's
right.
kind of the warm up. But again, consistency. This is something that needs to be talked about at all times. So there's employing Indigenous people, resourcing them, working with grassroots organizations. There's land back, the land back movement, where corporations own land. Where can they give land back to the proper original owners? There's the land back movement. Then there's advisory boards, incorporating people as part of your diversity, equity, and inclusion committee, bringing in those folks who lead your local tribes, etc., that your company's land is on, and the customers that you serve and the people that you employ and the land that you're on. Bringing in Indigenous folks as part of your advisory board, as part of your DEI commitments and your strategies. That's absolutely doable for everybody. And then hiring Indigenous vendors as part of your supplier diversity program, being very intentional in working with vendors who are owned and operated with employees who are of Indigenous ancestry and backgrounds. So there's so many different ways. It's listen, pay them, involve them, co-create with them, especially around Earth Day. Anything you do on your environment, society, and governance, your ESG reports, as far as I'm concerned, must include people who are Indigenous. Must. They understand how to live one with the land. So any ESG policy that does not have any Indigenous involvement is going to fail. It cannot be sustainable because you're not incorporating the people who have thousands and thousands of years of knowledge and stewardship of how to be sustainable. So you are just completely missing it. That you will never, your ESG policy will never ever be successful without the involvement and the payment and the co-creation of said policies and programs without Indigenous people. Just it cannot happen because there's no way that we know better than them. You know, it's no way, not at all. Anything you want to add to that?
Well, there's something that we say here in Canada. I'm not sure if you say that as well in the US, but it's nothing for us without us.
That came out of the disability movement in the 60s. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So, everything that I was just talking last week with someone from the health services industry, and she was talking about they're really struggling to connect with Indigenous communities because they're coming to them with solutions. And I was, I just said to her, I was like, you got to take that back. You got to stop right there. Stop telling them exactly what it is that you want to do for them, because they may be really good ideas, of course, but Indigenous peoples know what they need. They know what their people need. They know what their communities need. And so stop, listen, build relationships, take time. You got to build trust. You got to build that trust back, and just take time to listen and get to know who they are and what matters to them before you start forcing, policies or things that you want to do to help them, because they know better than anyone.
1,000%. I just like the point of just like, stop, stop.
Yeah.
It's there's so much I can comment on what you just said. Yes, stop.
Yes.
Yeah. So I have two more questions for you.
Sure.
One is, what are some ways that we as internal, external communicators, marketing communications, I'm going to tap into all of your professional experience. How do we decolonize our communications? What do we need to be mindful of around our strategies, our language, our visual representation, etc.? So what are some ways that we can literally decolonize our communications?
There is a language that resonates with Indigenous peoples, and it's subtle changes. The order in which you even talking about Indigenous peoples, capitalizing Indigenous peoples, never calling them our Indigenous peoples. There are 3 distinct communities in Canada that make up Indigenous peoples, and that's First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Making sure that you're always including, if you're talking about Indigenous peoples, that you also call out First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Like I said, the subtle language changes. I mean, there are a few, I can't think of any that I'm right now, but representation in your photography, in your marketing, very rarely do you see Indigenous peoples, modern day Indigenous peoples, doing regular things, going for coffee, having dinner with their family. It's very stereotypical. You see regalia and teepees and smudging. And so look for, it's difficult. There is a stock photography deficit for Indigenous representation for sure. But do your best. We talk about that in DEI in general, is making sure that your audience is represented in your marketing images and your stock photography. But, try to look for Indigenous people and in modern day representation. There's a lot of kick-ass women entrepreneurs out there right now. Indigenous women entrepreneurs are doing really amazing things, and highlight them when you can. Know their stories. Find out what matters. Yeah, I don't know. That's the advice.
Absolutely. And there's powwows that are open to the public.
Yes.
And
they all are.
You are a guest. If you're non-Indigenous, you are a guest. And those of us who are not raised in our traditions, like Elizabeth and I, but want to reconnect to that culture and are kind of fumbling our way through without the guidance of our elders, because my grandmother isn't here anymore. Is yours?
No.
Yeah. So we're kind of fumbling our way through all of this. And, but there's certain protocols and behavior that we need to respect when we are a guest at powwows. Sometimes it's okay to take pictures and videos, and sometimes it's not. It's a sacred experience that they're doing in a drumming circle, for example. So running around, doing a live Instagram thing is not welcome. So, understanding and kind of following their lead, and you are a guest, but they open up powwows specifically for the public for these reasons, to be invitational, to learn their customs and traditions, and to celebrate them. And I recently did an Instagram and a LinkedIn post specifically talking about that, where I was a guest at Juneteenth when I was visiting Nashville. I went to a Juneteenth festival, and, white women showing up to a Juneteenth festival. I am a guest. And everyone should have that experience. Everyone should do this constantly. When we're allowed, when we are invited, and, we don't go crash when we're not invited, but, we do not have the entitlement to go wherever we want, in whatever group we want. We do not have that right. That is crossing the line. But when there is an open invitation to be a part of cultural traditions and celebrations and ceremonies that we are not culturally tied to, we need to go and learn how to be a guest and get to know their experiences and their lives and their traditions, their language through their eyes. Learn and listen to the stories. And that's one of the sweatshirts that I wear when I visited the tribal headquarters of the Muskogee Nation in Okmulgee, Oklahoma. I got myself a sweatshirt that on the back of it says, we're still here. We're still here. So, talking about your visual representation, the whole idea of just like, things from the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. Yes, that's all true, but not as a replacement of, we are still freaking here. We look different, many of us. There was interracial marriages, throughout generations, and not even interracial. There was obviously a lot of victimization of sexual abuse that occurred as well. But we look different, and many of us are trying to reclaim and get back in touch with something that was taken away from our elders, from our ancestors. But know that we're here, we're still here, and there's a lot that we have to offer. And so the equity work for communicators is to break down that access, to create more access, break down those barriers, bring in the Indigenous voice to our communications. And so I can't stress that enough. So my last question for you, Elizabeth, after then we'll wrap up, is what is communicating like you give a damn sound like, look like, feel like, when it comes to being representative and respectful of Indigenous people?
I mean, I think we've talked about this, and just to build on what you're talking about in terms of, our skin color, I mean, we look very white presenting. And so when I speak about Indigenous peoples and the plight of my family, and, when I'm helping to amplify Indigenous voices, that matters. We have the channels, we have people that'll listen to us. We've been afforded a certain amount of privilege in our life because of the way that we look. And so it's really important to give space and time and help amplify those voices of people who don't look like us, who didn't have the opportunity to speak, and to help, further things like this, like representation, being able to talk to other communicators and say, there are subtle things that you could do in your communications to make sure that those people feel included, that they feel seen. It's subtle, but it matters. And so, I don't know. I feel like that's my jam.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think part of our personal journey has really been recognizing that our grandmothers, our great grandmothers who did have darker skin tones had a very different life than what we've been afforded here. Yeah. And so recognizing that privilege and trying to utilize it to give voice to the stories and to create more visibility for those who do have the darker skin tones, and give them power and, and visibility and voice, because they are our partners right now moving forward if we let them, and we have to let them. We have to. To me, it's not an option. We have to fold in Indigenous folks to lead us in a lot of the work that our companies are doing, especially around Earth Day, like I was talking about earlier. So how can people follow you, get in touch with you, learn more from you?
So you can find me on LinkedIn. I am, sorry, Kim, I don't actually have all my stuff set up yet, really. So just LinkedIn, I guess. Do you want me to just say that?
Yeah, sure. Just find me on LinkedIn. Well, and spell your last name, just because, you know, some people may miss the E.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so you can follow me on LinkedIn. My last name is Bunney, Bunney with the EY. Lots of people want to say that it's Bunney, but it's actually just Bunney.
That's kind of cool, though. You got, like, you know, the French pronunciation. That's made up, totally, but okay.
Yeah, so you can just find me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on there, along with my IBC folks and the IBC chapters. So that's where you can find me.
All right. Well, thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your personal and your professional experience. The Pope stories were great. So thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for the voice and visibility that you provide. And I wish us both luck as we continue on our own personal journeys. Thanks for being here, Elizabeth.
Thank you for having me, Kim.
So what popped out to you from the conversation? The more conscious communicators in the world, the better the world. So go to communicatelikeyougiveadamn.podcast.com and set up a one-on-one strategy session. And until next time, let's keep taking care of each other.